Welcome to the Small Triumph Sports Library and Archives channel. It's time for the long overdue part 2 of my 2024 work update on my GT6 project, and we'll jump right into it on the other side. This video has taken me much longer than I anticipated. I actually began by recording some videos for this episode, and then I did not like them. I didn't think they were high quality, and it was kind of going to be difficult to slice and dice them to make it into a good sort of coherent story about my work on the car. There were some organizational issues in terms of how I wanted to put things together and how I wanted to talk about them. And I ultimately decided to primarily do a slideshow, at which point I had to go through my many photos of my work on the car. I've taken lots of photos as I've dismantled the car. I've taken a lot of photos as I've worked on different parts of the car. So there was a lot to go through. And then there were some things that I couldn't find. So it was kind of challenging to put this episode together, more challenging than I expected it to be. So here's the story. After much consideration, I decided that my main work for this past summer was going to be reconstructing the B-posts of my car, which were distorted and torn, just generally messed up in places from the car being struck quite hard in the rear at some point early in its life. I've covered this in the past. There were repairs that were done, back in the 1970s that were very poorly done. The car was on the road for a long time in the condition it was in, but there were a lot of problems. And the deeper I dug into the car, the more problems I found. So my initial plan was, let me take off the rest of the rear wings and let me go ahead and get these B-posts straight and maybe build up the back end of the car. Some of you who are smarter than I, and especially if you're aware of the condition of my car, are probably saying, that's a really dumb idea. And you're right, and I'll get to that later. In many ways, this episode involves many examples of the fact that it is amateur hour in my garage. But anyway, my original plan was to rebuild the B-posts, and I was going to start with the driver's side, which had the most severe damage in most ways. And I would use the passenger side as a template. So I was going to start by rebuilding the left-hand B-post, straightening it out, using the right hand as a template for different things that needed to be done. And then when I was finished with that, I was going to move on to the other side, and then I was going to go ahead and work on the car moving backwards from there. So that is the initial plan. But where I actually ended up starting out was not at the B-post, but at some distortion related to it. My actual starting point was to clean up some distortion in the internal roof structure. Obviously, since the car was involved in a severe rear ender, there are a series of distortions on both sides of the car that lessen in severity as one moves from the back of the car to the front into the cabin. The area that I'm showing here represents basically the frontmost part of the car's most severe distortions from its most severe accident damage. This would seem to largely result from force applied to the post, the top of which you can see there on the bottom of your screen, when the lower B-post area was mangled in the accident. Now let me begin by saying that with some of the car's problems, it's difficult to know what is the direct result of the car's most severe accident and what was actually caused during the ham-fisted 1970s repairs. I'll speculate about this in a limited way here and there. The driver's side inner roof structure had some distortion in it here around the B-pillar, and in a few places the top of this structure was buckled or pushed to the point where it almost touched the inner part of the outer roof panel. Somehow, some way, I can't find any good photos of this area before I started working on it. This photo was taken after I had started to address some of the problems. This photo shows the remaining distortions in that panel from another angle, and again you can kind of get a sense of what I was working with, although again this photo represents what it looked like after I had already started messing with it. Here's an image of the other side, which isn't nearly as bad. However, the other side helps to illustrate one of the types of problems I was trying to correct. The places at the top of the inner structure that were buckled nearly into the back of the outer roof panel. There are a couple of severe examples of this type of problem on the other side, on top of the other different distortions that I was dealing with. Now here's a shot of the side I was working on again after I started drilling out spot welds. As with the earlier photos, this was taken after I had used studs and a slide hammer in the central crater, an area that I've roughly circled around the center of the photo, and then carefully used a small pry bar to pull the top edge away from the inner part of the outer roof panel in places. The two places where this top edge was pushed out furthest are roughly indicated by the yellow arrows. Things look very rough at the stages that I've shown, of course, and the results seem to be on their way to unsatisfactory. So that's why I decided I would need to cut this piece out, straighten it, and patch it back in, a process which I've started in this photo. This would also make it easier to correct some problems with the roof pillar at the floor of the quarter window, as it was pulled down slightly in the accident, leaving a dip in the drip rail. And here is the area after I cut out the problem piece and cleaned up the area. You can see here that I also ground down some of the weld outside where the post meets the outer roof, creating a hole there. And here's a better look, and you can more clearly see the hole and little distortions here. I took the cutout and immediately started cleaning it up, and I used a vise and a hammer and so forth and so on to try to get it back into proper shape. Then I welded up the holes and tried to clean up some of the distortion in the hole for the headliner rail. Things still needed some work at this point, of course, so I continued with it, and eventually I got it reasonably good. I mean, it doesn't need to be perfect. And after straightening out the inner structure a little bit, I started to look at how it will go back in, although I still have some work to do before I proceed with welding. Here, in this particular photo, you can actually see another problem a little further back than the panel I'm working on. You can see how the spot welds for the inner structure on this side of the car, in the back, all popped off in the car's worst accident. At this point, I drilled out all of the spot welds and cleaned up the area in anticipation of clamping it back down and doing plug welds. However, I'm not going to put it all back together permanently until I'm sure everything is in order. And as you might expect, I discovered adjacent problems. And let's get to a key one now. Here's the car the day I brought it home with my son standing in front of it. And this photo was actually published in the Vintage Triumph, which is the bi-monthly magazine of the Vintage Triumph Register, with an article that I published in that magazine a couple of years ago. And here's a shot of the left-hand B-post inner structure as I was initially stripping the car. This is in June 2020, as you can see there on the screen. You can see the distortions in that area of the car in the photo. And here it is from another angle. This one showing the giant hole right there around the messiest part of the B-post structure. It would not surprise me if this area ruptured during the car's worst accident, but I also believe that someone intentionally burrowed it out to get a good angle for roughly beating out the crunched up rear wing from the inside. Flash forward to May 2023 when I started cutting off the rear wing. Here I've obviously taken off the rear, 80%-ish of the rear wing. Here you can pretty clearly see the distortion in the B-post structure if you look at the far left-hand side of that photo. Now we get to this summer when I cut out the remainder of the wing. By the way, here you can see Triumph's rust-proofing efforts in the form of the black treatment down low on the car. I, of course, have that stripped off at the very bottom there. Here it is from another angle after some additional cleanup work. The next step was to remove this inner strengthener from beneath the quarter window portion of the roof. This is referred to in the GT6 factory parts catalog as the waist rail closing panel. Here is the area after removal. This panel was an absolute bear to get off. My drilling always seemed to miss the main part of the spot welds, and it fought me all the way, but eventually I managed to get it off. Here is the closing panel, and of course a chunk is missing from the front, as you could see earlier with the giant hole in that area. And I spent an afternoon trying to patch this piece. I worked using the other side as a guide or template, and I tried to match the shape. And then I hand formed a patch panel and then lined everything up. And from there I made a straight cut on both panels and welded things up, and ended up being unsatisfied with the results you see here. This would probably work, but the shape is not quite right, and I plan to revisit this later. You'll notice there are a lot of things that I have made progress on and then dropped and put off for later as I got deeper and deeper into the structure. That's probably not the best way to work, but it's how I ended up working this summer. Here's an image taken after starting to melt the lead in the infamously messy part of the GT6 B-post. If you do an online search for conversations about this area of GT6s, you'll see a lot of talk about how messy this meetup of different metal pieces is. I was still a bit uncertain about how it was constructed, even after having it torn down this far. I worked through it with a fellow Triumph enthusiast, AJ Jones, who deconstructed a cutout of this part of a GT6 that he had on hand and kindly walked me through what he found with some nice drawings. Those drawings are his, and I'll not share them here, but the short version of the story is highlighted here. The two-piece post in red has flaps on the bottom that weld on to the body structure at 4 points, including those highlighted here, especially the flap that is welded to the top of the roof area under the window. That area, highlighted in yellow, is actually rolled under at the top of the B-post. Highlighted here in blue, the inner strengthener panel, called the rear wheel arch front outer panel in the factory parts catalog, is folded down and out of the way nearest the door, but then comes up and is welded in the wing seam toward the back where the outer flange is highlighted in yellow, although here I've bent that part of the panel down and out of the way. So consequently, here's a shot from the other side of the car that illustrates how the panel fits up into the wing seam in the back and is pushed down in the front. Again, bear in mind this side too is distorted from accident damage, so what you're looking at just gives a sense of how the car was constructed when it rolled out of the factory, but it's not quite right in that photo either. Back to the side of the car I was working on, and here's the area after I removed the top portion of that front inner strengthener. So here's the panel as I cut it out. You can clearly see the flange that sticks up to be welded into the wing seam. However, note that I straightened out the front part that in its position on the car is actually folded down. So what you're looking at here does not really represent the way that it actually looks on the car. This is after I had straightened it out some. And here's another angle so that you can see how this piece is constructed. Unlike what I expected, the top of the panel does not simply have flaps to tie it in, but rather is a partially closed shape that in the front is just hammered down and out of the way of the other adjoining pieces, and then that back part sticks up and gets welded into the wing seam. I went ahead and ordered replacement panels for this area for both sides of the car. These are listed for the Spitfire by Moss. Like most of these replacement panels that come with red primer, they are not exactly like the originals and are in places welded rather than stamped, but they're fairly close to the original and not too horribly expensive. So I picked them up thinking it would be much better to modify and use them or parts of them than try to repair the poor panels from the car. And this is especially true of the one on the passenger side of the car, which is pretty severely ripped. As I was working on the driver's side this summer, I stripped the replacement panel, which had its original primer chipped off in places, and reprimed it in gray 2K epoxy primer. Here's the back side, and you can see how the panel is welded into shape instead of fully stamped. Also, it is not semi-enclosed at the top, but rather there is simply a flap there, but I think it provides a good starting point. It can easily be modified, but it also doesn't have to be exactly like the original to serve its purpose. Here you can see that although the original is distorted, that is, it's not quite shaped correctly, the holes kind of sort of line up with maybe around a 1/4 inch of difference. Here's the B-post area after some straightening and priming to protect some of the bare metal, especially at the bottom of the car. And here is another shot of that area. You can see just how much has been stripped out at that point, how bare and fragile it looks at this stage of things. Unfortunately, as I was doing some of this deconstruction and starting to straighten some different things out, I realized that I had a major snag. Because one of the things that I did as I was messing around in the area is I wanted to test fit the quarter window. And what I thought I was doing was just making sure that I wasn't moving anything out of position in a way that was going to cause problems further down the line. I didn't realize that I already had a problem. So, remember, my operating assumption about this car was that while there was ample poorly repaired accident damage, it had been on the road in this state as a complete car for thousands and thousands of miles before it was stored away. So I considered that if the car was on the road and everything fit on the car, then I had a good starting point for the work I was doing. However, after doing some of the work that I've already covered, I began test fitting the rear quarter window and immediately realized that it didn't fit right. So this window should fit pretty flush all the way around, and you can see it definitely does not. So the next step was to determine if the fit was always that way or if some of the work I had done had made some kind of change. So the first thing I did was pull out the seal for that window, and I quickly discovered something I didn't realize when I was stripping the car. Someone had cheated out the top of the gasket with a piece of foam weather stripping to try to make the window seal at the back top. And here that foam strip is highlighted. Next, I started looking at photos of the car when I brought it home, and sure enough, it's very clear that that particular window didn't fit right. This is a close-up from a photo taken the day I picked the car up, and you can clearly tell that the back top of the window is out, nearly flush with the window opening in the roof instead of properly recessed within it. This is where I reached the limits of my skills and experience. At least that's the way I'm going to describe it. This drove me completely nuts. The rear quarter window on the other side of the car fit almost perfectly, despite some distortions around it. This side didn't fit, and I couldn't figure out why. I tried to use the other side of the car as a reference. I tried eyeballing it, something I discovered I'm really bad at. I tried measuring it. I used straight edges. I tried to measure from central points in the car. Tried all different kinds of things, and I couldn't really figure it out. And I lost probably a week and a half or 2 weeks on this. I was doing other little tasks in the background, but I was spending a lot of time just looking at this and trying to figure it out. and wasn't having any luck whatsoever. I got a little whiny about it. I started thinking about trying to cheat the post to make the window fit, but I wasn't really comfortable with that. I just got to the point where I started trying to talk myself into it some, and every time, the idea popped into my head or I said something about it, I didn't feel good about it. I figured there had to be a way, there had to be something that I was missing. So I ended up calling in one of my friends from the local British car club, Tim Melton, who's an experienced restorer, and he's helped me on some projects in the past. And I just asked if he'd be willing to come out and give me some help and help me figure out what I needed to do to get the window fitting properly. It ended up being a smart call because his experience really paid off. And it took us the better part of a morning kind of going back and forth and working on different things. But we did eventually get it sorted. There are two main things that I learned over the course of that day. First of all, while I intuitively had some sense about the connection between all the little distortions, obviously you get in an accident and it starts at one location and then there's a ripple effect through the car. And I knew that people typically say you want to work backwards in straightening everything out. So I kind of always had that in mind, and that's part of why I started my summer's work on the B-posts where I did. But I also didn't really have the experience or knowledge to fully understand the relationships between what you can see here and what you can see over here. And so Tim was a big help with that, sort of refining my sense of those things. The other thing is I learned a very important lesson about the value of a big-ass hammer. Tim brought with him some of his tools, and that included several extremely large ball peen hammers, some of which were approaching the size of sledgehammers. And I had been trying to hammer out things on the car with relatively small hammers, and I suddenly realized the value in having a really giant hammer. Let's start with that value of the big ass hammer. So as I discussed previously, my car's most severe accident caused some buckling in the inner wheel arches. And in a previous video, I had stated that I thought I was going to need on each side to cut out the front part of the wheel arch, reshape it, and then patch it back in. And this was largely because my brief attempts using relatively small hammers had been ineffective. However, my friend Tim took one of his giant ball peen hammers, and I backed the wheel well with two hands and as much force as I could on a large dolly, and we beat the thing back into shape. Not perfectly yet, but it's much better. This is part of a process of trying to get things in the general vicinity of the rear quarter window in good enough shape to better assess the problem. Here's the improved wheel arch from another angle. We also improved some other things in the area. And in the end, Tim helped me to see that the real problem was that the area under the window was still pushed in too far from the car's original accident damage. Now, my father and I had already pulled this area out based on what we could tell, but it turns out it wasn't nearly far enough. And in order to actually move it into proper position, we had to do some more dismantling of the B-post and use some force. And after we did that, the window ended up fitting pretty well. So now we've reached the point in the story where my friend Tim turned to me and he said, "You can't really go much further with what you're working with right now. You have got to get your bonnet squared away and on the car, and then get your doors lined up with your bonnet, and then use that to guide your B-posts and rear wings." All of which made perfect sense to me. It seemed logical and commonsensical, and in fact, I wondered why I had never thought of that before. So I ended up punting on the work I was doing and shifting gears to the front of the car. And I figured since I was going to be doing those things, I might as well try to take care of as many little things at the front of the car as I could this summer. The first order of business was to address the accident damage to the front crossmember. So I stripped it and hammered it out, getting it mostly in shape. And obviously I was using my newfound hammering skills or knowledge, whatever you want to call it. Anyway, I got most of its shape back. However, I couldn't get the bottom edge exactly right. So I went at it with an air hammer and actually made a bit of a mess. So I had to weld up some holes, and the holes filled up nicely, but the other parts were a struggle. And it was only at the end of the day that I thought about the fact that the crossmember sheet metal is a good bit thicker than the body sheet metal I'd been welding previously. I should have adjusted the settings on the welder accordingly, but I didn't. And that's just another example of how it's often amateur hour in my garage. But the repairs will do, especially for now. Next, I had to attack the bonnet, which needed some repair work from some of the accident damage to the car. So here you can see how the front right-hand corner of the car was struck and how that slightly kicked out the back of the wing. With the headlamp area badly creased, I went ahead and bought a replacement bonnet wing shortly after I got the car. The other problem was the nose of the bonnet, and this is obviously damage related to what I showed of the crossmember. This is a shot from before I started stripping the car, but the lighting here clearly shows the problem. The nose was punched in and mostly just gooped with body filler. It practically took the jaws of life to get the grill out from behind that mashed up nose. Here's the bonnet standing up off the car prior to stripping. In this photo, I was actually testing the fit of my Vietnamese stainless steel bumpers that I purchased for the car. To my dismay, I can't seem to find any good shots of the nose from after I stripped it. It's just another case. I've got 5 million photographs from different stages of stripping and working on the car, and I go to look for what I need for video and I can't find it. I don't know if I didn't take the photos or if I just can't find them, but regardless, I can't seem to find any good shots of the nose from after I stripped it. This is the best I can do, and it's from the background of a photo of something else. Although the quality is poor, you can see how badly off the shape of the nose is. And you kind of tell that from the other photo, but this makes it maybe a little clearer. Another problem is that the bonnet support tube was bent up on the side of the bonnet that was hit, and here you can see how the sides were splayed out and the flap at the front was distorted. You can see improvements on the left here. It took some hammer work and bending on a vise to get everything close. It still needs a little bit of fine tuning, but here it's another case where I considered it was good enough for the short term. I managed to get the nose closer to correct, but it's obviously still mashed down here. Here's a shot from the bottom, just because at present the grill still doesn't fit right. It's still a tight squeeze, and the two halves don't meet up in the middle exactly right. It is better than it was before. So the whole thing is a process, still needs work, and I really haven't decided about the best approach to the bonnet nose. I think I've sort of reached the limits of hammering and prying and all of the techniques I've tried so far. I'm really going to have to decide how to get it the rest of the way back into shape, and I've had some different suggestions, some of which involve trying to find a straight nose and patching it in, which very few noses out there are very straight. But, that's one option. Also, potentially just slicing the bonnet carefully and trying to move it that way. I still have a lot to figure out in terms of getting the bonnet the rest of the way into shape. The next move that I made is I went ahead and test fit the new British Motor Heritage Valance that I purchased for the car. My original Valance is all bashed up and in pretty bad shape. So I went ahead, test fit that, and then test fit the bonnet itself. And it took a little work, but we did get it fitting reasonably well. So at this point, the most critical aspects at the front of the car seemed to be in order. So the next move was to remove the damaged wing from the bonnet. I've found that the removal of the outer panels is time consuming and tedious because of the number of spot welds, of course, but fairly straightforward. And these panels, the outer wings, have not fought me too much. Some, but not too much. Of course, the cleanup work, filling holes left behind from drilling out spot welds and, an occasional tear from some chiseling and that sort of thing, that cleanup work is and can be quite tedious. The new wing came with the typical black E-coat, but it arrived all scratched up with some surface rust, so I went ahead and stripped the inner part of the panel so that I can prime it after I get everything properly fitting. At this point, the inner part of the panel is bare metal, treated with Eastwood Fast Etch for protection. So the new wing was allegedly made on the original factory tooling, and it looked perfect, but I initially struggled to get it to fit properly in a couple of places. I could clearly see some areas that needed work from the accident damage, but some of the little distortions were not obvious to my untrained eye. Consequently, I ended up calling in my friend Tim again, and we got the wing fitting pretty nicely over the course of a few hours. Although it still needs some tweaks, I'm really satisfied with the fit, and everything seems to line up fairly well, well within the range of adjustment as far as I can tell. The biggest problem area were some slight distortions in this front corner near the turn signal indicator. This corner needed to be pulled out, rolled out a bit to get it back into proper shape so it would line up with the new wing. But we got it there. Everything looks good with the bonnet. Everything seems to be symmetrical, so I feel good about that. So I plan to use screws to position the bonnet, especially in all the places where it is fitting well right now. But I do have one final adjustment to make. I'm going to have to move the wheel arch support bracket circled in yellow there in the middle of your screen. The bracket itself needs some little repairs. There's at least one little tear in it. So I want to remove it. That'll enable me to check everything carefully and make sure it's sound. But also, the shape of the new wing and the bonnet center panel match up almost perfectly, except for there is a little, very slight dip in the center panel right at this wheel arch support bracket. And so removing it, maybe making some little adjustments to the center panel, and then maybe very slightly repositioning this support bracket will make it, hopefully, so that the wing and the bonnet center panel line up perfectly, and then I'll be good to go. So that's where things stand at the moment. I really wish that at the end of the summer I had been at a point where I could have fully and properly fit the wing and then primed the inside of the wing and welded it on the bonnet and have been done with that. I've had the bonnet squared away. But as the summer wound down and as school ramped up, I just wasn't in a place to complete that work. So everything is on pause at the moment. I'm not sure when I'm going to have an opportunity in the future to do concentrated work on the car. maybe a little bit over the Thanksgiving holidays. I will certainly work on the car some over the winter holidays. The problem is, of course, that as we get into late fall and early winter, it may be too cold to do some of the priming that I need to do as part of the jobs that I have before me, but we'll see. I'll do the best I can with the conditions I have to work in when the opportunity presents itself. I do have an eye toward focusing on working on the car next summer, and I do have a clear plan and a better sense of what I need to do now. So hopefully that will enable me to get more accomplished next summer than I managed to do the past couple of summers. I guess we'll find out. That's it for this episode. I do have a couple of other episodes in the works, a couple of shorter episodes that I hope to post sooner than later. However, everything seems to come together very slowly these days, so I don't want to make any promises. I'll only say that I do have additional content in the works, and I do hope to get something posted sooner than later. In the meantime, please take care, and thanks for watching.